All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Jacques Derrida of Grammatology reading group. And this is our second reading. We will hopefully be continuing from the signifier and truth towards the end of writing before the letter, which is the chapter that we are in at the moment. The signifier and truth is obviously a title that implies a lot of things, especially the word truth, but hopefully here we'll see Derrida elaborate on what he's talking about. So I'm going to read this first passage here and then ask for any questions or comments afterwards. The rationality, in quotes, hyphen, but perhaps that word should be abandoned for reasons that will appear at the end of this sentence, which governs a writing thus enlarged and radicalized, no longer issues from a logos, and it inaugurates the destruction, not the demolition, but the desedimentation, the deconstruction of all the significations that have their source in that of the logos. So the term logos here comes from, as I talked about last time, the Greek word that's effectively their word for language, but it has more to do with like a dialogue or to speak. And it is the origin of what we refer to as logic. And so what Derrida is questioning here is the sedimentation that makes a dialogue or a system of logic possible. And he's basically saying that the thing that underpins writing, like a physical visual inscription, is something that will come to undermine this. Particularly the signification of truth. All the metaphysical determinations of truth, and even the one beyond metaphysical ontotheology that Heidegger reminds us of, are more or less immediately inseparable from the instance of the logos, or of a reason thought within the lineage of the logos, in whatever sense it is understood. In the pre-Socratic, or the philosophical sense, in the sense of God's infinite understanding, or in the anthropological sense, in the pre-Hegelian or the post-Hegelian sense. Within this logos, the original and essential link to the phone, which is italicized here, so he's talking about a auditory component, has never been broken. Earlier when he's talking about pre-Socratic and pre-Hegelian, post-Hegelian, he's talking about like logos or the dialectic, right? It would be easy to demonstrate this, and we will attempt such a demonstration later. As has been more or less implicitly determined, the essence of the phone would be immediately proximate to that which within thought, as logos relates to sense, produces it, receives it, speaks it, puts it together. If, for Aristotle, for example, spoken words are the symbols of mental experience and written words are the symbol of spoken words, it is that voice, and then in square brackets he has vowel here, productive of the first symbols, has a relationship of essential and immediate proximity with the soul. Producer of the first signifier, it is not one simple signifier among others. It signifies the state of mind which itself reflects or reflects upon things by natural resemblance. Between being and soul or mind, things and feelings, there would be a relationship of translation or natural signification. Between sound and mind and logos, a relationship of conventional symbolization, and the first convention, that which would relate immediately to the order of natural and universal signification, would be produced as spoken language. Written language would establish the conventions linking other conventions among themselves. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Or if not, I'll elaborate here myself.
No, I don't have any questions.
Okay. So he earlier here he's talking about how Aristotle would have claimed that spoken words are the symbol of mental exercise and written words are the symbols of spoken words. So writing is being seen to serve speech and Derrida, as already earlier in the text, questioned this hierarchy and said that perhaps it shouldn't be writing shouldn't be seen to serve speech, to be written down to preserve speech. It should be considered its own thing as a visual way of communication that's different from speech. And also Aristotle is kind of appealing here. He's saying that speech itself is like a direct connection to mental experience, which is something that I would also be skeptical of. And he leads into a quote here. Just as all men have not the same writing, so all men have not the same speech sounds. But mental experiences, of which there are primary symbols, are the same for all. So, as also, are those things of which our experiences are the images, which is from, I believe, Hegel. Kind of, again, the same thing is being uttered here, right? That speech is an access to primary symbols within the mind that are the same for all, which we'll continue here and see what Derrida has to say about that. The effects of the soul mind expressing things naturally constitute a sort of universal language which can then efface itself. It is the stage of transparence. Aristotle can sometimes omit it without risk. In every sense, the voice is closest to the signified, whether it is determined rigorously as sense, thought, or lived, or more loosely as thing. With regard to what would wed the voice indissolubly to the soul or mind, or to the thought of the signified sense, even to the thing itself, whether it is done in the Aristotelian manner that we have just signalled, or in the manner of medieval theology, determining the res as a thing contained from its eidos, from its sense thought in the logos or in the infinite understanding of God. All signifiers, and the first written signifier would be derivative. So all signifiers would be derivative of these mental symbols, right? The written signifier would always be technical and representative. It would have no constitutive meaning. This derivation is the very origin of the notion of signifier. So signifier is a term in semiotics, which is seen to be a replacement for the signified. For instance, the word tree or a picture of a tree could be seen as a replacement for the actual tree. And he's saying that basically it has its roots in Aristotle and people like Hegel thinking that there's this pure essence of symbology in the mind that then is produced and replaced through speech. The notion of the sign, and the sign is the signifier and signified both together, always implies within itself the distinction between signifier and signified, even if at the limit, according to Saussure, simply as the two faces of one and the same leaf. It remains, therefore, within the heritage of the logocentrism, which is also a phonocentrism, absolute proximity of voice and being, of voice and the meaning of being, of voice and the ideality of meaning. Hegel demonstrates very well the strange privilege of sound in idealization, the production of the concept and the self-presence of the subject. Does anybody have any comments or questions?
So here it's pretty clear that one of the biggest points of contention is that there's this weird privileging of like the phonology, how things are uttered, how things are kind of like spoken over the written language, right?
Yes, and he uses the term phonocentrism as well, as well as logocentrism, which kind of already implies that, right? Yeah, definitely. I was going to say something else, and it slipped my mind. Yeah, it's sort of viewed as when you're speaking, it's like you're present, right? And you have a more direct access to somebody's primal symbology or whatever. And that writing is like an extra step removed, and so it's seen as less important. There's another quote here. which I believe is also from Hegel. The ideal motion in which through the sound, what is, as it were, the simple subjectivity, and then Hegel's word for subjectivity that I'm not even going to try and pronounce, the soul of the material thing expresses itself. The ear receives also in a theoretical way, just as the eye, shape, and color, thus allowing the interiority of the object to become interiority itself. The ear, on the contrary, perceives the result of that interior vibration of material substance without placing itself in a practical relation toward the object. A result by means of which it is no longer the material form in its repose, but the first more ideal activity of the soul itself, which is manifested. So again, more of what we were speaking of earlier. What is said of sound in general is a fortiori valid for the phone by which, by virtue of hearing, understanding oneself speak in dissociable system, the subject affects itself and relates to itself in the element of ideality. One already has a premonition that phonocentrism gets mixed up with the historical determination of the meaning of being in general as presence. That meaning that something was viewed as more of a being or more pure of a being, or perhaps only as a being if it was present, right? And the one who writes is not present when you read what they have written, but they are always present when you hear them speak, except now in the modern age, now that we can record things as we're doing now. But, ignore that. With all the subdeterminations which depend on this general form and which organize within it their system and their historical concatenation, presence organize within it their system and their historical... Oh no, I'm misreading this. My apologies. After concatenation, there's brackets, and then it says presence of the thing to the sight as eidos, presence as substance, essence, existence, temporal presence as point of the now or of the instant, self-presence of the cogito, consciousness, subjectivity, co-presence of the other and of the self, intersubjectivity as intentional phenomenon of the ego. Logocentrism would thus be solidary with the determination of the being of being as presence, to the extent that such a logocentrism is not totally absent from Heidegger's thought. Perhaps it still holds that thought back within the epoch of ontotheology, within that philosophy of presence. That is to say, within philosophy as such, that would perhaps signify that one does not exit the epoch, whose closure one can outline. The movements of belonging or not belonging to the epoch are too subtle. The illusions in that regard are too easy for us to come to a conclusion here. There's an interesting translation here where it says epoch, but I'm assuming it's supposed to be Heidegger's epoche, which is more like an epoch for the phenomena, right? I mean, that's essentially what it is. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting here that Derrida is going on to even question Heidegger's ontology in the first place by saying that even it is predicated on an idea of presence, which, to elaborate more, in Heidegger there are two states that he refers to, Vorhanden and Zorhanden, present and at hand and ready to hand. So a thing that's ready to hand is something that you're kind of unaware of that it's there. Like maybe you have like your glasses on your head and you're looking for your glasses and you don't know where they are, and they were there the whole time, right? It was just kind of aware, you were looking through them the whole time, you were using them, and you weren't fully aware of what you were doing. And then present to hand would be when I start to consider something as a philosophical object. I actually start thinking about it, right? And they have these scissors here or whatever, right? And I'm regarding them. I'm not just using them, right? I'm thinking about what the scissors entail and what they're composed of. And the problem with this is that both of these things are present in a way. They're both there. There's a preference for presence over absence that Derrida is questioning. Does anybody want to add anything? Okay. The epoche of the Logos thus debases writing considered as mediation of mediation, and as fall into the exteriority of meaning. To this epoch would belong the difference between signified and signifier, or at least the strange separation of their parallelism, and the exteriority, however extenuated, of the other to the other. This appurtenance is organized and hierarchized in a history. The difference between signified and signifier belongs in a profound and implicit manner to the totality of the great epoch covered by the history of metaphysics, and in a more explicit and more systematically articulated manner to the narrower epoch of creationism and of Christian infinitism, when they appropriate the resources of Greek conceptuality. This appurtenance is essential and irreducible. One cannot retain the convenience or the scientific truth of the Stoic, and later the medieval opposition between signans and signatum, without also bringing with it all its metaphysiological theological roots. To these roots adheres not only, and that is already a lot, the distinction between the sensible and the intelligible, with all that it commands, namely metaphysics in its totality. And this distinction is generally accepted as self-evident by the most vigilant linguists and semiologists, even by those who believe that the scientificity of their work begins where metaphysics ends. Any comments on that paragraph before I read this quote relevant here that he has? So, I mean, again, he's starting to question the difference between signifier and signified to begin with, and he's even saying that the entire history of metaphysics has kind of been dependent on this preference of presence over absence because of logos, right? And the same thing, and he's saying the same thing applies to linguists and semioticians as well, in that there's always been a preference in linguistics for the way in which words are pronounced. If anybody's ever looked at linguistics, they're obsessed with the phoneme, right? And he's saying that this is ingrained in everybody, a preference of presence over absence, of being over non-being as well. And he's going to go here and give an example. Thus, for example, quote, as modern structural thought has clearly realized, language is a system of signs, and linguistics is part and parcel of the science of signs, or semiotics. The medieval definition of sign, it stands for something, has been resurrected and put forward as still valid and productive. Thus, the constitutive mark of any sign in general, and of any linguistic sign in particular, is its twofold character. Every linguistic unit is bipartite and involves both aspects, one sensible and the other intelligible, or in other words, both the signans, signifier, and the signatum, signified. These two constituents of a linguistic sign, and of sign in general, necessarily suppose and require each other. Derrida goes on to say, but to those metaphysico-theological roots, many other hidden sediments cling. The semiological, or more narrowly linguistic science, cannot therefore hold on to the difference between signifier and signified, the very idea of the sign, without the difference between sensible and intelligible. Certainly, but also not without retaining, by the same token, more profoundly and more implicitly, the reference to a signified able to take place, in its intelligibility, before its fall. Before any expulsion into the exteriority of the sensible here below. To the extent that as the face of pure intelligibility, It refers to an absolute logos to which it is immediately united. This absolute logos was an infinite creative subjectivity in medieval theology. The intelligible face of the sign remains turned toward the word and the face of God. Any comments or questions? Something I want to touch on from the last passage is that Derrida is kind of saying here that even the Abrahamic religions like Judaism and Christianity got sucked into this preference of presence over absence, when a number of thinkers, Plutarch I think is the most easy one to mention here, incorporated readings of Plato into the Old Testament, and he actually thought that Plato was a student of Pythagoras, who was a student of Moses, which is why he believed that Plato's philosophy was so close to the Old Testament that Moses wrote. And he would do philosophical readings into the Old Testament, breaking it down using Plato's ideas. Avicenna did a very similar thing with Islam and Aristotle, and so would Augustine, and St. Thomas Aquinas would also bring Aristotle to Christianity. And Derrida is basically saying here that those relations, among others, mixed up this lacking of metaphysics, this preference of presence in metaphysics, in the history of metaphysics, into theology as well. Particularly the Neoplatonists, right, who explicitly, like Plotinus, who explicitly take Plato's theory of forms and rework it to such a way that it applies to God in the Christian sense, which obviously the way in which an ideal form is itself believed is thought to come about and be understood. It's possible to be understood through speech, because speech is a direct access to the primary symbols within the mind, which are like reaching back to the ideal forms that you once knew, potentially, right? And so they all get wrapped up together in that way. I'll continue here. Of course, it is not a question of rejecting these notions. They are necessary, and today, at least for us, not a thing is thinkable without them. It is a question at first of making evident the systematic and historical solidarity of concepts and gestures of thought that one often believes to be able to separate innocently. The sign and divinity have the same place and time of birth. The epoch of the sign is essentially theological. Perhaps it will never end. Its historical closure is, however, designated. We should all the less renounce these concepts, as they are indispensable for unsettling today the heritage of which they are a part. So again, Derrida has mentioned this earlier, and I didn't really touch on it, but there's definitely a constant appeal to this idea that all of these communication of signs that we're using are dependent on a historical context and a current cultural context as well, as opposed to being like these pure symbols of communication that we just pull from like the ideal world. Within the closure by an oblique and always perilous movement, constantly risking falling back within what is being deconstructed, it is necessary to surround the critical concepts of a prudent and detailed discourse, to mark the conditions, the area and the limits of their effectiveness, designate rigorously their appurtenance to the machine whose deconstruction they permit, and, with the same stroke, the fault through which lets itself be glimpsed. Yet unnameable the glow of the outside of the enclosure. The concept of the sign here is exemplary. We have just marked its metaphysical appurtenance. We know, however, that the thematics of the sign have been about for a century, the agonized labor of a tradition that professed to withdraw meaning, truth, presence, being, etc., from the movement of signification. Putting under suspicion, as we just have, the difference between signified and signifier, or the idea of the sign in general, we must make it clear just as quickly that it is not a question of doing so in terms of an instance of the truth as present, anterior, exterior, or superior to the sign, in terms of the place of difference effaced. Quite the contrary, we are disturbed by that which in the concept of the sign, which has never existed or functioned outside the history of the philosophy of presence, remains systematically and genealogically determined by that history. It is there that the concept, and above all the work of deconstruction, its style, remain by nature exposed to misunderstanding and misrecognition. Any comments? Okay, so he's again drawing on this thought that for all the way up to Hegel, right? And it's really easy to see where this is happening in Hegel, and how he's kind of just repeating the same mistakes that Socrates was making, even with the Socratic method, is that there is this idea that we can tease out or withdraw a meaning or truth or presence or being just by talking, just by using words, from the movement of signification, as he puts it, right? And in Hegel, it's so clear, right, with the dialectic, with the Hegelian dialectic, that there's this idea that from the movement of signification and like this contradiction emerging, that then suddenly we'll move closer to this pure like unification of absolute spirit at the end, right? Which Derrida is calling into question by immediately calling into question the difference between the signified and the signifier to begin with. Interestingly here as well, he uses the term genealogically, which I know in interviews he said that for a time he considered using it, but he actually doesn't even like that term, which is a term used by Nietzsche and Foucault a lot. Which is kind of like for those that aren't aware, it's kind of like a study of the way in which ideas can come about from a certain environment and their history, like a genealogy of life, right? Like an ancestry, but for cultures and ideas and things like that. But Derrida still doesn't like it because it implies an origin. It applies a true origin at some point at the beginning of this era of genealogy, right? In much the same way that I have like an ultimate ancestor, biologically. I'll continue here. The exteriority of the signifier is the exteriority of writing in general, and we will attempt to show later that there is no linguistic sign before writing. Without that exteriority, the very idea of the sign falls into ruins. Since our entire world, and all language would collapse with it. Since its evidence and its value keep, to a certain point of derivation, an indestructible solidity, it would be somewhat foolish to conclude from its belonging to an epoch that it is necessarily to move on to something else, and to get rid of the sign of this term and this notion. To perceive the gesture we are sketching here appropriately, the expressions epoch, closure of an epoch, historical genealogy must be understood in a new way, and they must first be withdrawn from all relativism. So Derrida is making it clear here that he's not a relativist, which is funny because he's obviously the post-structuralists are often criticized for being a relativist or the postmodernist, whatever term you want to use. And he's kind of saying here, look, there's still a way in which we can see that not all communication is equal just because I'm breaking down the inherent meaning of an individual sign. And he's also criticizing this idea that we can move beyond the sign, which is ultimately what the Greeks like Plato and Socrates thought, but also Hegel. Right? Hegel thinks that we'll eventually reach a point of absolute spirit, of absolute freedom, where we are escaping the signification by reaching some stage thanks to the Hegelian dialectic, right? And the Socratic method is the same, right? Eventually, you whittle down, you just keep talking about a thing, and eventually you get to like the ideal form of the thing, or what is justice, or whatever. If you talk long enough with Socrates about it, you'll find out about the true universal meaning of justice, right? Which is and Derrida thinks that's silly because it's likewise dependent on an epoch. Thus, within this epoch, reading and writing, the production or interpretation of signs, the text in general as fabric of signs, allow themselves to be confined within secondariness. A truth or a meaning already constituted by and in the element of the logos precede them. Even when the thing, the referent, is not immediately related to the logos of a creator God where it began, by being the spoken thought sense, the signified has at any rate an immediate relationship with the logos in general, finite or infinite, mediated with the signifier, that is to say, with the exteriority of writing. When it seems to go otherwise, it is that a metaphoric mediation has insinuated itself into the relationship and has simulated immediacy. The writing of truth in the soul opposed by Phaedrus to bad writing, writing in literal and ordinary sense, to sensible writing in space. The book of nature and God's writing, especially in the Middle Ages, all that functions as metaphor in these discourses confirms the privilege of the logos and founds the literal meaning then given to writing. Sign signifying a signifier itself signifying an eternal verity, eternally thought and spoken in the proximity of a present logos. The paradox to which we must become attentive is the following. Natural and universal writing, intelligible and non-temporal writing, is thus named by metaphor. A writing that is sensible, finite, and so on, is designated as writing in the proper sense. It is then thought on the side of culture, of technique, and of artifice, a human procedure, the ruse of a being accidentally incarnated or of a finite creature. To be sure, this metaphor remains enigmatic and refers to a proper meaning of writing as the first metaphor. This proper meaning is yet unthought by the holders of this discourse. It is not, therefore, a matter of inverting the proper meaning and the figurative meaning, but of determining the proper meaning of writing as metaphoricity itself. Any comments here?
Oh, no, I don't got it.
Okay. So I think he's making an interesting point here, talking about Phaedrus, right? So he Derrida kind of identifies a finite writing that Phaedrus considers bad, that being literal writing, which is, this idea that I could write something and it could mean just one thing, or could mean only a few things. And then sensible writing to space, that being like a metaphorical or poetic writing, which Derrida is calling infinite because of the infinite interpretations held within. Obviously, I don't think he believes in a literal writing at all, but he's just saying that it's interesting that this is believed to be like a superior form of writing or a more proper form of writing, and that the actual analysis of what it comes down to writing is itself in the possible meaning present there. In the symbolism of the book, that excellent chapter of European literature and the Middle Ages, E.R. Curtius describes with great wealth of examples the evolution that led from the Phaedrus to Calderon, until it seemed to be precisely the reverse, by the newly attained position of the book. It seems, however, that this modification, however important in fact it might be, conceals a fundamental continuity. As was the case with the writing of the truth in the soul, as in Plato, in the Middle Ages too, it is a writing understood in the metaphoric sense, that is to say, a natural, eternal, and universal writing, the system of signified truth which is recognized in its dignity. As in the Phaedrus, a certain fallen writing continues to be opposed to it, a history of this metaphor remains to be written, forever opposing divine or natural writing to human and laborious, finite, and artificial inscription. The stages of that history, marked by the references that we accumulate here, must be articulated rigorously, following the theme of God's book, nature or law, indeed natural law, across all of its modifications. There's a quote here in a moment that I'll read in a second. So obviously he's talking about the Phaedrus by Plato here, which I think I misspoke earlier and implied it was a person. Obviously not. Does anybody want to say anything? Okay, something I'm just going to point out here and add here that I neglected to mention earlier is that this form of dialectic logos-based reasoning was in the Middle Ages as well, and it was called disputation, as well as many other methods. But disputation is basically where somebody says something and you just like rigorously disagree with them as much as you can to try and find all the faults in it. And it's kind of like an evolution of the Socratic method, or evolution implies progress, but perhaps not. But anyway, they have a very similar methodology then as well. Quote, Rabbi Eliza has said, if all the seas were of ink and all ponds planted with reeds, if the sky and earth were parchment, and if all human beings practiced the art of writing, they could not exhaust the Torah I have learned, just as the Torah itself would not be diminished any more than is the sea by the water removed by a paintbrush dipped in it. Galileo responds, the book of nature, is written in a mathematical language. Descartes, and to read in the book of nature. Dimea, in the name of natural religion, in the dialogues of Hume, and this volume of nature contains a great and inexplicable riddle, more than any intelligible discourse or reasoning. Bonnet, it would seem more philosophical to me to presume that our earth is a book that God has given to intelligences far superior to ours to read, and where they study in depth the infinitely multiplied and varied characters of his adorable wisdom. J.H. von Schubert, this language made of images and hieroglyphs with supreme wisdom, uses in all its revelations to humanity, which is found in the interior language of poetry, and which, in the most inferior and imperfect way, is more like the metaphorical expression of the dream than the prose of wakefulness. We may wonder if this language is not the true and wakeful language of the superior regions, if when we consider ourselves awakened, we are not plunged in a millennial slumber, or at least in the echo of its dreams, where we only perceive a few isolated and obscured words of God's language, as a sleeper perceives the conversation of the people around him. And then finally, Jaspers, the symbol as cipher is the handwriting of an other, which intelligible universally is existentially deciphered. So what he's going over here is basically, a bunch of statements from people found in the text mentioned earlier, the symbolism of the book, with their comments on what a text might mean. Does anybody have any ideas why he might be talking about this? Whilst I have a drink quickly.
No, I don't have any idea.
Very much a case of people privileging the spoken word, it seems. The one by Schubert is a bit this language made of images and hieroglyphs, more like a dream than the prose of wakefulness. There seems to be a lot of almost hidden premises, I guess. I don't know. There isn't really much for me to say about this.
I think there is an identification kind of a movement here, right? Where Eliza is kind of saying, there's stuff that I learned in my mind that could not be written down in the form of the Torah. And then Galileo is saying, no, it's nature, the book is written in a mathematical language from nature. It comes from nature, it comes from the universe. some universal constant greater than I. Descartes also seems to think of it as a book is like a great book of nature, right? Capital N. Hume has like a similar position, right? He thinks that nature is great and indecipherable. It's his view on the universe and causality, right, is that the universe doesn't need a beginning because I am just a man, and it's not my place to question the causality of the universe. I only know the causality of man. It's a bit you're right. There's a bit more complicated with the Schubert because it's longer, but the language of poetry is kind of viewed as inferior and imperfect to it's a metaphorical expression of the dream than the prose of wakefulness. So all these people seem to think that the contents of the book come from some grand, unifying, mystical, universal understanding, which it is to an extent privileging speech, yes, but also there's like something else. There's a theological component there, and Derrida is going to kind of question that and say no, all these things are historically and culturally contingent first. Even what you might think of as the great whatever nature or your understanding of this. And he'll continue here saying, above all, we must avoid neglecting the profound differences which mark all these treatments of the same metaphor. In the history of this treatment, the most decisive cut appears at the moment when, at the same time as the science of nature, the determination of absolute present is constituted as self-presence, as subjectivity. It is the moment of the great rationalisms of the 17th century. From then on, the condemnation of fallen and finite writing will take another form, within which we still live. It is non-self-presence that will be denounced. Thus, the exemplarity of the Rousseauist moment, which we will approach later, begins to be explained. Rousseau repeats the Platonic gesture by now referring to another model of presence, self-presence in the affects, in the sensible cogito, which simultaneously carries in itself the inscription of divine law. On the one hand, representative, fallen, secondary, and instituted writing in the proper and narrow sense is condemned in the essay on the origin of languages. It enervates speech. To judge genius from books is like wanting to paint a man from his corpse, etc. Writing in the colloquial sense is a dead letter. It is the carrier of death. It takes the breath of life. On the other hand, on the other face of the same assumption, writing in the metaphoric sense, natural, divine, and living writing is venerated. It is equal in dignity to the origin of value, to the voice of conscience as divine law, to the heart, to effects, and so forth. Any comments?
No comments.
We'll probably continue here to up to the written being, the being written, which is the next page. So we won't go much longer. But yes, he's again bringing up Rousseau, who earlier kind of touched on his preference, and he has like a quote from Hegel as well about alphabetic writing being more pure, right, being superior because it's phoneticized, and he's like he rejects pure writing, visual writing, like a logograph, or which already logograph is like a logocentrism, right, or a gram, or some sort of pictographic language that he considered savage or barbaric. And then he was also continuing on to say that trying to understand a genius from their books is like wanting to paint a man from his corpse. Obviously, looking down very much on how useful a book is, which is obviously quite funny because we only know about Rousseau thanks to things that were written down. I'll continue here with a quote. The Bible is the most sublime of all books, but it is, after all, a book. It is not at all in a few sparse pages that one should look for God's law, but in the human heart where his hand deigned to write. If the natural law had been written only in the human reason, it would be little capable of directing most of our actions, but it is also engraved in the heart of man in ineffable characters. There it cries to him, which is from La Tête de Guerre, which I don't know. I'd have to check the citation. Again, kind of touching on that similar thing. Although I think it's funny here that even here, human reason is seen as insufficient, right? And it has to be inscribed on the heart of man in ineffable characters, like ineffaceable characters. Like this thing that always has to be present with us, right? That's superior and it's better, it's more pure because it's always present with us, right? Unlike a book, unlike reading from a book, which isn't always present. That isn't immediately accessible to us. Natural writing is immediately united to the voice, vowel, and to breath. Its nature is not grammatological, but pneumatological, I think that would be pronounced. It is hierarchic, very close to the interior holy voice of the profession of faith, to the voice one hears upon retreating into oneself, full and truthful presence of the divine voice to our inner sense. Quote, the more I retreat into myself, the more I consult myself, and the more plainly I read these words written in my soul. Be just, and you will be happy. I do not derive these rules from the principles of the higher philosophy at all. I find them in the depths of my heart, written by nature in ineffaceable characters. There would be much to say about the fact that the native unity of voice and writing should be prescriptive. Archer speech is writing because it is a law, a natural law. The beginning word is understood in the intimacy of self-presence as the voice of the other and as commandment. There is, therefore, a good and a bad writing, the good and natural, divine inscription in the heart and the soul, the perverse and deceitful technique exiled in the exteriority of the body, a modification altogether internal to the Platonic diagram. Writing of the soul and writing of the body, writing of the inside and writing of the outside, writing of conscience and writing of the passions, as there is a voice of the soul and a voice veil of the body. Conscience is the voice of the soul, the passions are the voice of the body. The voice of nature, the holy voice of nature, that joins divine inscription and prescription, one must constantly return to it, talk to it, interact within its signs, speak and respond to oneself between its pages. Any comments here, or should I read this last section?
It's actually kind of like really, I guess like here it's a very just flat out challenge towards the kind of taken for granted metaphysical difference between written and spoken language. But on a like, I'm trying to kind of like make this semi-commensurate. Maybe this is like a really, really bad way of approaching this, but like semi-commensurate to like,
I mean, he's saying that it's interesting, right? There's like a way in which meaning is inscribed within oneself that's okay. That's an okay form of writing. But deferred writing is not okay. A prescriptive writing, right? It's not external to the body. Is seen as profane.
But when we look at it from like, this is the kind of incommensurate way that I'm looking at it, like looking at it from a kind of a psychological, cognitive sense. This metaphysical difference that is seen in Rousseau, Hegel, and so on is very, very much kind of present there as well, but also kind of like challenged in the sense that people can kind of still have ambiguity from spoken speech. If there was any kind of like badness of writing that is being suggested here, it seems like it's suggested that, oh, it has lost meaning. But so does spoken speech. Like there's a lot of ways in which like how someone is speaking verbally, those verbal utterances would be somehow lost meaning. So it's like very weird metaphysics, very weird psychology that is like that this duality rests upon.
I think it's this inscription on the inside that Derrida might call grammatology. Although grammatology would be is anything inscribed, really, but that's the point at which it's possible for us to understand something. And I think he would say that there isn't really any difference between speech and writing in that sense. There's always this thing that we go back to within ourselves, within our own historical and cultural context that we use to even understand the written or spoken word, right? And you're right in that from the perspective of Hegel or whoever, there is like this loss of meaning, even through speech. But Derrida is kind of saying, well, what is lost? There was nothing to be lost because the only sense in which it meant something was through your own grammatological understanding way, right? So there's no place for it to be lost. And also another quote from him from I can't remember exactly where it's from, but he says, my words tell me what my thoughts are. It's kind of like this. I'll read this last section here. Quote, "It was as if nature had spread out all her magnificence in front of our eyes to offer its text for our consideration. I have therefore closed all the books. Only one is open to all eyes. It is the book of nature, capital N. In this great and sublime book, I learn to serve and adore its author. The good writing has therefore always been comprehended as that which had to be comprehended within a nature or a natural law, created or not, but first thought within an eternal presence. Comprehended, therefore, within a totality and enveloped in a volume or a book. The idea of the book is the idea of a totality, finite or infinite, of the signifier. This totality of the signifier cannot be a totality, unless a totality constituted by the signified pre-exists it, supervises its inscriptions and its signs, and is independent of it in its ideality. The idea of the book, which always refers to a natural totality, is profoundly alien to the sense of writing. It is the encyclopedic protection of theology and of logocentrism, against the disruption of writing, against its aphoristic energy, and, as I shall specify later, against difference in general. If we distinguish the text from the book, we will say that the destruction of the book, as it announces itself today in all domains, denudes the surface of the text. That necessary violence responds to a violence that was no less necessary. Which is everything here. And we'll continue reading next week. We didn't get too far, but there's not that many people here, so I'm not willing to go super far and not super feeling great today anyway. The next section is called the written being and / the being written. Something else I want to talk about here that Derrida doesn't talk about is Judaism, in that the Torah was only written after. So the old Judaism, they had the first temple, right? I think it was in Babylon. And they were a temple religion. They were a spoken religion, right? They would speak from the platform, and they had like a cultural heritage that was spoken. And it was only after Babylon was raided and captured, and the first temple destroyed, that they wrote the Jewish people wrote the Torah to continue their cultural heritage. And so there's already there a predisposition towards speech being better than writing, right? They only used writing as a preservation of speech. It came secondary after a speech, which I think is interesting. So is it surprising that a culture that developed from those same ideas over thousands of years is itself very preferential to speech over writing?
I guess what's interesting about that is like it seems to be hold on. There's something a bit weird about like Derrida's going there's something a bit weird about how there's this very, very strict relegation of writing as kind of the necessary preservation rather than kind of like the kind of the embodiment, the continued embodiment of the faith, the continued embodiment of a religion. Because I don't know, it just does seem like there's a bit of a I think you've mentioned this before, like this disillusionment also and kind of trying to reaffirm certain aspects of Judaism, or probably not, probably misremembering this.
It's possible. I don't remember that, but it is weird in that today we sort of view religious stuff as coming directly from the book, right? But there's a way in which the Bible or the Quran or the Torah were written that favors speech over writing, presence over absence, and so we still cling on to that culturally, and we just don't realize. We think we're reading from the holy book or whatever, and getting the true word of God, but there's an aporia there, right? There's an inherent contradiction waiting to be unveiled. And some thinkers picked up on that, and they noticed, the Bible is only a book, right? It may be the greatest book of all, but it's still only a book. Which is interesting. Which is an interesting inherent contradiction, right? Can you continue then to read from the book while still holding that? Anyway, sorry, go ahead.
What does this say about the literalism that is present in kind of religious circles?
Yes, there is some religious circles have a very big tradition of hermeneutics, right? Especially Judaism. But I'm thinking here of the exclusive brethren and many sects in Islam where there is no acceptance of interpretation, but you cannot help but interpret. So it's you're shooting yourself in the foot, right? There's going to necessarily be a drift there, whether you like it or not, because whatever is meant by the text, however literal you want to take it, even the literalism you're taking is going to change because of the cultural context that it's being understood in.
Mm-hmm.
Which is very Barthian, however that's pronounced. So yeah, I think I'll leave it there for now. Again, I'm going to leave a link to the Discord channel, the reading group in the description and in the comments. And I hope you all enjoyed, and I will see you all in the next.